Caution! The AJ and Quill show contains D&D content and is intended for a D&D audience. And, besides that, they're really weird. Hi everyone, welcome to Total Party Quill, D&D Player University and your stop for Monster Tactics in 5th edition. I'm Professor AJ and with me as always is my fearless companion, Quill the Dragon. Say hi, Quill.
Greetings, puny humans. Prepare to absorb the knowledge Quill will dispense with his mighty jaws.
Now, in 10 days as of the recording of this video, the new adventure from Dungeons & Dragons will be coming out, The Wild Beyond the Witchlight.
In this adventure, you're taken to the Feywild. And if it isn't obvious, the Feywild is the Dungeons & Dragons representation of a place like Wonderland from the Alice stories.
And before the release, we're going to be able to provide you with a sneak peek at one of the legendary creatures inside this adventure, the Jabberwock. And then we're going to do that voodoo that we do so well and do lore and combat tactics for that creature inside this adventure.
Which hopefully you'll be able to use to guide your combat encounter.
Well, that bell means the class has started, so pull out your notebooks and let's get cracking.
First, let's see what the flavor text actually says about this monster.
The Jabberwock is a solitary, temperamental predator that hunts pristine forests and ancient ruins. Accurate descriptions of Jabberwocks are difficult to come by because the rare survivors of an encounter with one usually retain only confused impressions of its parts and not a sense of the whole. Now, pieced together accounts describe a sinewy dragon-like creature that can walk on its hind legs as easy as it travels on all four, and its eyes can emit these fiery beams. Once a Jabberwock has chosen a target, it concentrates all its attacks on that target until the victim is killed and devoured, or until the Jabberwock is killed, or until the target escapes somehow using like magical teleportation or some other means. If a Jabberwock is slain, another one appears 3d8 years later, materializing within 1,000 miles of where the original one perished. No immature Jabberwock has ever been sighted, and the creature does not appear to age. Wow, what a super description for an alpha predator of legend.
But let's see how this translates into the monster's stats.
Now, a Jabberwock is a CR 13 huge dragon, typically chaotic evil. It has 10d12 hit dice. It has a walking, climbing, and swim speed of 30 feet, and a fly speed that's double that.
This is pretty typical for a dragon, really.
It's proficient in every single saving throw. It also has proficiency in perception. It's vulnerable to slashing damage, but only slashing damage from a Vorpal Sword. It's immune to poison and the poison condition. It has true sight to 120 feet.
As well as a whole bunch of other abilities like Confusing Burble, Legendary Resistance, Regeneration, Tracking, a multi-attack,
breath weapon, and even its own set of legendary actions.
I'm okay.
So what you're saying is, it's a dragon.
Right, and a legendary creature.
Now this is all pretty cool, but what isn't the flavor text telling you?
Now, this isn't the first time a Jabberwock actually appeared inside Dungeons & Dragons. Now, the Jabberwock is a fictional character and ferocious monster described in the nonsense poem Jabberwocky, which appears in the novel Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll back in 1871.
Alice, the heroine of the story, discovers this mock epic poem in a book that she can read only when it's reflected in a mirror.
Now, in that poem, a father cautions his son to avoid the Jabberwock, this fearsome creature that attacks with its teeth and claws. Upon encountering this demonic beast, the boy hero then slays and beheads this creature using his Vorpal Sword, much to the joyous relief of his father.
And this poem is where D&D adopted the concept of a Vorpal blade, and why Vorpal blades have the ability to decapitate opponents on lucky strikes.
Now, the interesting thing was, Carroll's poem actually ended up taking on a life of its own outside the original story.
And it's an excellent example of nonsense verse and the use of portmanteau words.
And if we're being honest, if you can get somebody as awesome as Christopher Lee to voice this creature, then you got it made.
All that being considered, let's cover the tactics.
Right. How do Jabberwocks behave in combat? Now, generally speaking, when a creature can fly, it's going to use that in combat because that's a really big advantage to have to give up.
Simply put, a flying creature will stay aloft well out of reach of its enemies, then it will swoop in and attack its land-bound victims.
Right, after it attacks, they typically fly back up into the air well out of reach again, and they just keep repeating that until the enemies are dead.
It's an efficient way to do combat in 5th edition, and the Jabberwock can certainly fight this way.
But the Jabberwock's statistics and its confusing burble ability tell a much different story.
These both indicate a much stronger preference for up-close melee fighting.
Right, so let's cover the stats first. A Jabberwock's primary offensive ability is going to be its strength.
At 20, that's quite impressive.
And a Jabberwock's primary defensive ability is going to be its constitution.
This is indicative of a brute combat profile.
Right, and a brute is just what you would call the monster version of a tank class.
It's a tough creature with a strong preference for in-your-face fighting.
Right, and most dragons typically are brutes.
So this tracks.
Now, its confusing burble ability also has a limited range, which would also give an indication for up-close, in-your-face fighting, but we're going to cover that in a second.
On its own turn, a Jabberwock's primary attack is going to be its fiery gaze breath weapon.
Right, as long as it's available. Now, before using its breath weapon, a Jabberwock will always reposition itself so that it can get the most amount of creatures within the area of effect of its breath weapon.
Now this ability recharges on a 5 or a 6. This means that in an average combat, it will only get to use it once.
Right, but dice be crazy, so you might be able to use it every single round if the dice are nice.
The dice are never nice.
Now on its next turn, a Jabberwock is then going to engage in melee combat. It's going to charge the front line.
The front line is where the bulk of the melee fighting is going to happen, and typically it's where the tank will stand.
Now, it's going to try to stand 10 feet away from any of its melee opponents, while also trying to get as many creatures as possible within the range of its confusing burble.
Now a Jabberwock is going to choose a target, and it's going to attack that target exclusively.
Now, we're going to be nice and suggest that that specific target usually be the party tank, because they're designed to take the damage.
And if their first target dies, the Jabberwock will, on its next turn, gobble them down as a free action, then simply choose its next target, and start this all over again.
Now, this is really important to note. If anyone in the party has a Vorpal Sword, the Jabberwock is going to target that specific enemy first.
It will target someone with a Vorpal weapon over any other target.
Now, this is because, even though it's simple-minded, a Jabberwock recognizes that a Vorpal weapon is a threat, even though it might not actually consider the wielder of that weapon to be a threat.
But let's cover its confusing burble while we're at it.
For its confusing burble, creatures at the start of their turn, if they're within 30 feet of the Jabberwock and they can hear it, have to make a charisma saving throw or be unable to take reactions until the start of their next turn. They must then roll randomly to see what other thing happens to them. It's either going to be nothing, nothing, and move randomly, or attack and possibly nothing.
Now why do all this? Simply put, failing a save at the start of your turn is like being incapacitated without actually saying incapacitated.
An incapacitated creature can't take actions or reactions, which is essentially what this confusing burble is doing, although it has the added benefit of also making you randomly walk around, possibly into environmental hazards, or causing you to randomly attack a nearby creature.
This is one of the reasons the Jabberwock will position itself 10 feet away from anyone it's attacking in melee. If they roll a 4 for this and have to attack something, but they can't reach the Jabberwock, they're likely to attack a nearby ally instead.
Now, the whole reason for this is that there are actually a bunch of player class abilities that will end if they become incapacitated. Things like concentration. Now, if this ability actually incapacitated you, it'd be a much deadlier creature and way harder to fight. Now, on its turn for its melee attacks, using its action, a Jabberwock will always use its multi-attack.
It can use its Rend twice with this multi-attack, and it will never use its tail attack using its action.
Right, the tail attack is going to be exclusively used for its no-cost legendary action, which we're going to cover in a second anyway.
Now remember, a Jabberwock is single-minded in attacking its chosen target.
Right, it will attack that target exclusively until either the target's dead, the Jabberwock's dead, or they flee somehow. So it's not going to split up this multi-attack. All the multi-attacks Rends will go to that one target.
And honestly, even if you manage to escape a Jabberwock somehow, it can still hunt you down with its uncanny tracker ability.
Now, speaking of legendary actions, let's cover them.
Legendary actions are attacks the Jabberwock can do outside of its own turn.
Right, these help balance out the action economy for a lot of legendary creatures that are meant to be attacked one-on-one with a party.
The Jabberwock has 3 options it can use.
But let's cover the most expensive one first. The wing attack. It costs 3 actions, has a range of 10 feet, which is the same range as Rend attack. The wing attack then does some damage, and then has a high chance of knocking enemies prone if they fail a dex save. Now, because of the cost, and because the wing attack does less damage than a Rend attack, it's generally not worth using this ability against 1 or 2 enemy opponents, even though it does have a high chance of knocking them prone. I mean, really, it's only when you can get 3 creatures within the area of effect of this wing attack that it becomes worthwhile to use.
The next most expensive legendary action is its Rend.
Now, with these 2 legendary actions, you have a choice. Every round, you're either going to use the wing attack or the Rend attack, and that depends on whether or not you believe that sometime during the round, the Jabberwock is going to be surrounded by at least 3 enemy opponents. If it does, use the wing attack.
If not, use Rend.
Now, it also has a no-cost legendary action to use its tail. We talked about this before, and it's just going to use this whenever it's not using the other ones.
Simple.
Now for defense, the first thing you're going to notice is that it has a high natural armor, and it regenerates an impressive 10 hit points at the start of its turn.
Although slashing damage overcomes this regeneration.
Right, and that's pretty thematic for this creature, and it's really not all that hard for most parties to come by, since the most common weapon used in parties is a longsword. Now, a Jabberwock is vulnerable to slashing damage, but only slashing damage from a Vorpal weapon.
This is one of the reasons why if a creature has a Vorpal weapon, the Jabberwock will attack them first.
Right. The Jabberwock would consider a Vorpal weapon an actual threat, so it will attack whoever's wielding that weapon first. Now the Jabberwock also has legendary resistance. It can use it up to 3 times per day, and each time it does that, it lets it turn a failed saving throw into a success. Now, the Jabberwock is proficient in every single saving throw, so it's not going to be failing saves very often.
This means that anytime a Jabberwock fails a saving throw, it's going to use this ability.
Right, we're going to call this a standing decision. This is something that you're going to do automatically without thinking about it.
Do not save this ability. Use it every single time you fail a save. Period.
Now, if a Jabberwock is in melee and its breath weapon recharges...
It has a 1 in 3 chance of this happening, so it's not likely, but...
Right, but if it recharges, the Jabberwock will use its breath weapon. Now, if the Jabberwock needs to reposition itself to get the most amount of creatures within the area of effect of that breath weapon, it will do so, even if doing so means it's going to trigger opportunity attacks. But with its impressive AC of 18, legendary resistance, its high saves, its regeneration, the Jabberwock isn't even going to notice these opportunity attacks, much less care about them.
Plus, its confusing verbal feature makes it so that creatures who fail cannot take reactions. No reactions means no opportunity attacks.
But as a note, when it repositions itself, a Jabberwock will always include its primary target within the blast area of effect of its breath weapon.
Everyone else it catches in the fiery gaze is just gravy.
Now, based on the flavor text, we're going to say that a Jabberwock is not an evolved creature. Inside it says that if a Jabberwock ever dies, another one just reappears 3d8 years later fully grown. Like Wolverine, they regenerate and they don't age. Now the point is, a Jabberwock has very little to fear from actual death.
As such, we don't believe that it would ever suffer a morale failure from hit point loss and try to flee combat.
Right, a Jabberwock simply wouldn't value its life the same way that an evolved creature would with regards to death and dying.
Plus, the flavor text says that once they've chosen a target, they'll fight it to the death.
Now, speaking of Vorpal Swords, which are awesome, Inside D&D, if you didn't know, they're famous for being able to lop off a creature's head, killing it instantly if you roll a 20.
But when you read the magic item, it says that a creature is immune to this effect if it has legendary actions.
Like the Jabberwock does. So you really can't off with its head with a Vorpal Sword.
As a dungeon master, you may want to waive this restriction for the Jabberwock specifically, for thematic reasons.
All that being said, a Jabberwock is vulnerable to slashing damage from Vorpal weapons. So on a crit, even if you don't lop off its head, it's still going to take 24 d8 slashing damage, which is an average of about 108, on top of the weapon damage and your strength modifier.
Oh my.
Now, a Jabberwock only has 115 hit points total, so a 20 on a Vorpal Sword basically means death for this creature anyway, so it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. And that's it. This is all the steps and guidelines you're going to need to be able to use a Jabberwock inside your adventures, and hopefully inside the upcoming Wild Beyond the Witchlight.
Chris Perkins did say that you'll be able to use non-combat resolutions and encounters for this adventure.
Right, but with an intelligence of 4 and a wisdom of 7, you're not likely to talk your way out of getting eaten by this creature. Now, hopefully, when your players do encounter the Jabberwock inside this adventure, they're not going to have to fight it. Or heck, maybe they do fight it and it becomes an awesome epic adventure story.
But at CR 13, a Jabberwock can easily take out a level 8 party without too much of a hassle.
Right, so if they do decide to actually fight a Jabberwock, they better pray to Henry Cavill that they actually brought a Vorpal Sword with them. Anyway, thanks for tuning in. We hope to see you next time. Have a good one. We love you guys. Try to love each other. Get vaccinated. Stay safe. And is it time for school yet?
Bye. Game over.